but it is an agenda that says ultimately that we must have an economy and that we must have a government that works for all of us, not just the 1%. Thank you all very much. Talk about making public colleges and universities tuition-free. Oh, that's such a radical idea, it can't happen. A couple of months ago, I was at San Francisco City College. In that community, San Francisco made their City College two-year school tuition-free. They increased their enrollment for San Francisco residents by over 50%. Received an invitation to go to Milwaukee. They did the same thing. New York State, making public colleges and universities tuition-free. Tennessee, Republican state, community colleges tuition-free. That you have an economic system, a political system, and a media system that wants essentially to tell you that you are powerless. You don't got a couple of $100 million, don't get involved in politics. You're not a billionaire, don't run for office. That's what they are trying to tell you. And our job is to do exactly the opposite. Our job is to understand that this is what the history of this country is about, whether it's the history of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the environmental movement. The history of all progress always is that when working people and young people stand up and fight back, that is when change takes place, and that's the only way that change ever takes place. And the sexism and the homophobia and the xenophobia and the bigotry of the Trump administration. We've got to do that every single day. But the other thing that we have got to do simultaneously is bring forth an agenda that makes sense to ordinary people, whether they're black or white or Latino, Asian American, Native American, whatever it may be. And that is a progressive agenda, and I've just talked about some of the issues. But it is an agenda that says ultimately that we must have an economy and that we must have a government that works for all of us, not just the 1%. Thank you all very much.
The U.S. spends over $80 billion on incarceration each year. On top of that, America's criminal justice system is defined by pervasive, systemic, and institutional racism. At the end of 2014, the imprisonment rate among black men was nearly 6 times that of white men, and the rate for black women was double that of white women. Vermont is not immune to this problem. To the contrary, black men in Vermont are incarcerated at the highest rate in the country. That is unfortunately consistent with pronounced statewide racial disparities in a number of areas, including police encounters and school disciplinary action. Another feature of this system is its collateral consequences. The country's only starting to understand the overwhelming degree to which this epidemic impacts not only individuals, but families of incarcerated people and society at large. For example, each year 600,000 people nationwide return from prison to face immense challenges, including nearly 50,000 federal, state, and local laws and legal restrictions that make it difficult to reintegrate back into society, often denying access to employment, to housing, to education, and even the ability to vote. Lastly, I want to make clear that the time for this reform is now. We have seen growing bipartisan consensus that major reforms are long overdue, but that momentum is now threatened by a Trump administration whose Justice Department is clearly intent on turning back the clock to the racist and failed tough-on-crime policies of the past. In the coming year, the ACLU-Vermont is going to be rolling out the local version, Smart Justice Vermont, with the same goal, cutting Vermont's prison population in half. Like our ACLU colleagues around the country, we're going to be using impact litigation, strategic advocacy, backed by people power at the state and local level to win reforms in the following key areas, which are listed up here, and all of which we're going to be discussing in the breakout session. First, we're going to win bail reform. Roughly a quarter of the people in this state are awaiting trial, and many of them are incarcerated simply because they do not have the money to pay bail. It's time to end that. Secondly, we're going to win reform by holding prosecutors accountable. Many people do not realize the state's attorneys are among the most powerful elected officials in the state, with enormous discretion to decide the fate of the accused. When 96% of criminal cases never go to trial, prosecutors are the ones, not judges, who are driving the mass incarceration epidemic today, and at the same time they operate with very little transparency, oversight, or accountability. So that has to change. We're going to do it through sentencing and parole reform. Bottom line is that Vermont sends far too many people to prison for far too long at great societal and financial costs, and often in place of providing necessary treatment in terms of mental health and addiction. We're going to do it by ending the war on drugs. Drug criminalization, as many of you know, is a huge driver of mass incarceration, and states are waking up to the reality that drugs are a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue. And I believe that the opioid epidemic here in Vermont is further indication that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. Finally, through all of these areas and across this entire initiative, we are going to be focused on winning racial justice. As I said, no state imprisons black men at a higher rate than Vermont, and yet Vermont does not even track, Vermont's courts do not track the data that would show what is happening. Okay? That can't continue. And the good news is there are already a number of initiatives underway, including many initiatives led by people of color and people of color-led organizations, including Justice for All, Migrant Justice, Black Lives Matter, and others. But we all have to work on this together if we're going to win lasting and impactful reform. So I hope you will join me in the workshop following this panel. We're going to dig into each of these issues and develop strategies together to create a criminal justice system and a state that works for everyone. And so even if you don't join us at that panel, I just want you to know that there are materials that are in the breakout room if you want to come and pick those up. And likewise, there's some over on the table by registration if you want to find out more about the Campaign for Smart Justice or the ACLU. Thank you very much.
And that's not to say there's not other terrible things coming out of Washington. The assault on our voting rights, our civil rights, health care, reproductive rights, that's all bad. But what's really disturbing is the speed and the effectiveness that the administration has been able to undermine our environmental protections in a short amount of time. Given their incompetence in pushing their other agenda forward, they're actually really good at trashing the environment, and that's bad news for us. But because of that, on environmental issues, whether it's climate change, toxic regulation, or water quality, it's more important than ever that states step up and take strong stances on protecting the environment. So we're committed at PNRC not only to not ensuring that we don't roll back our commitment to clean water, that we double down on cleaning up our lakes and ponds. A lot of our focus on clean water is the implementation of Act 64. It was a legislation that was passed in 2015, and while not perfect, it was a comprehensive, long-term roadmap for addressing threats to water quality and pollution sources, whether it's agriculture, land development, wastewater treatment plants, stormwater runoff from developed areas, roads. It was a comprehensive approach to looking at how do we clean up Lake Champlain and by extension all of the other water bodies in the state. And it wasn't perfect, but it was an excellent start. We're pursuing some forest protection legislation this year because the cleanest water comes out of a healthy forest, and our forests are being fragmented, and the health is in decline in the state. We're also pursuing, in the early stages of pursuing some legislation to begin the long-term transition of Vermont's dairy industry away from conventional practices to more sustainable organic practices.